Then came the closing arguments. The courtroom got quiet, still as a painting. The judge gave the signal and the prosecutor stood first. He was smooth, practiced, replayed the most damning clips of the accident footage, leaned hard on the emotional testimony from the coworker, and painted the man on trial as reckless to the point of criminal. No room left for error, no room left for machines that failed or repairs that were never made. Just one man and a whole lot of blame. The jurors watched him like he was a preacher at a revival. Pens moving across yellow pads, eyes fixed, faces locked in. And me? I could barely breathe. It felt like I was underwater, like every breath came with the sting of knowing that huge parts of the story had never seen the light of day. Safety logs? Gone. Override records? Never explained. And here we were, building a case on half the truth. Then the defense stood up. His tone was quieter, slower, but he hit where it counted. Acknowledged the loss, but reminded them of what was missing. Talked about broken machines, ignored warnings, budget cuts, workers afraid to speak up. Pointed right at the factory manager's perfect suit and missing paperwork, and asked, "Does this really look like an accident no one saw coming?" He didn't shout. He didn't need to. And I sat there, watching it all, still wishing I could raise my hand. A hush settled over the courtroom like a heavy curtain as the defense attorney pressed his fingers against the lectern, the wood polished smooth by decades of similar moments. His voice carried just enough emotion to draw a clear picture of a man caught in a no-win situation, torn between doing his job and trusting his gut. Not a monster, not reckless, just someone trying to hold the line in a broken system. But as his words echoed through the room, I could almost feel the shift in energy. The jury, who had leaned in moments earlier, now seemed to retreat. Their faces returned to that quiet, unreadable calm. The prosecutor's message, personal responsibility, plain and simple, had clearly hit harder. And I couldn't help but wonder, had we all missed the point? My thoughts started racing. How did we let the bigger picture slip away? Why hadn't anyone pressed the factory inspector about his conveniently missing logbook? Why did no one ask the safety consultant to speak in plain English instead of hiding behind technical mumbo-jumbo? There were so many things left unsaid, and now it was probably too late. When the judge began giving her instructions to the jury, her voice slow and deliberate, it felt like ice water pouring down my spine. She reminded them to base their decisions solely on the evidence. No sympathy, no bias, no looking beyond what had been officially laid out. And that's when I felt it, a tight, cold knot right in the center of my chest, because I knew that door was about to shut. Once the jury went behind those walls, there'd be no more rewrites, no last-minute reveals. The clerk began handing out the verdict forms in sealed envelopes. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure someone would hear it. The judge gave the nod, and the bailiff led the jurors out. Chairs scraped, pens dropped. A stillness fell over the room like the calm before a storm. And I felt the weight of the gallery pressing in on me. The columns, the benches, the high ceiling, they didn't seem grand anymore. They felt heavy, closing in. Like all the truths that had been glossed over were leaning on me, waiting for someone, anyone, to say something. A sharp urgency surged inside me. I couldn't shake it. If someone didn't shine a light on what had been left in the dark, this whole thing would end up as little more than a polished performance. I thought about that consultant again, how his words rang hollow, about the plant manager's tiny flinch when asked about repair records, about how the jury never really reacted when the defense brought up the bigger system that failed. They were listening, but were they hearing? I knew then I couldn't just sit back. I had to do something, anything, before that verdict landed. It might already be too late, but I wasn't ready to give up. The final morning of the trial came, and the courtroom buzzed with this low, tense energy. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, catching dust in the air like glitter, and I showed up early earlier than anyone else in the gallery. I slipped into my seat and watched the jurors file in, quiet and serious, their faces stiff with the weight of what lay ahead. The defendant sat at the front. Same man, same seat. But today he looked different, like he was bracing for a blow. The judge gave a slight nod, and the attorneys stepped up for their closing arguments. The prosecutor went first, polished shoes clicking on marble as he walked to the lectern. His voice rose and fell like a conductor directing an orchestra. He retold the accident in painful detail, twisting metal, screaming steam, the terrified yells that bounced off warehouse walls. He called the defendant careless, even reckless, and said the law had no choice but to hold him to account. I watched the jurors. They were locked in. The prosecutor's story had rhythm, conviction, like a drumbeat you couldn't ignore. By the time he sat down, there were slow nods in the courtroom. Even the air felt heavier, as if his words were still hanging there, pulling the whole place downward. Then it was the defense attorney's turn. He stepped up quietly. His voice was softer, more personal. He talked about loss, about the defendant's spotless record, about the family he provided for. He reminded them about the broken equipment, the budget cuts, the ignored warnings. He painted a picture of a man trying to survive inside a crumbling system. But I could see it. His words weren't landing like the prosecutors had. The jury listened, yes, but not like before. Their pens still moved, but their eyes weren't searching anymore. They glanced at notes, at suits, at lights, not at truth. And that same knot in my chest twisted even tighter. I heard it in every word they didn't say. No one brought up the safety consultant's warnings, not once. Nobody asked about the missing inspection reports, and not a soul mentioned how the company pressured workers to blow past alarms just to keep things moving. Everything outside that one man's control had been treated like background noise, while all the blame got pinned right on his shoulders, like a target painted in courtroom ink. Then the judge stood, her robe catching the light as she prepared to give the final instructions. That's when it hit me. Hard. This was it. Once those jurors walked through that door, there'd be no turning back. She reminded them to only weigh what had been presented, to be impartial, to shut out emotion, and in her calm voice I could hear the quiet truth. The rest of the story wasn't going to be heard, not unless someone spoke up. The clerk handed out the verdict forms, each one sealed tight. I looked at the jurors. They weren't just listening anymore. They were bracing. You could see it in the way they held their pens, like they were already halfway to a decision. My heart was pounding. My palms were soaked, but I stood. I hadn't felt that kind of resolve since I first sat in that jury box. I wasn't officially part of the trial anymore, but in my bones I knew I still had a role to play. A man's future hung in the balance, and the picture they'd been shown was missing half the pieces. I couldn't stay silent, so I stepped into the aisle. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "Your Honor," I said, steady and clear, "may I speak before the jury retires?" The whole room froze, like someone had cut the volume on the world. The judge looked down at me, gavel in hand, her face carved with surprise. The prosecutor narrowed his eyes. The defense lawyer leaned forward, catching on to the weight of what I was about to do. There's a rule, I remembered, about when a person outside the jury can be heard, if what they say could affect justice, and I believed with every fiber of my being that this mattered. The judge hesitated for a second. Her expression was unreadable, procedural, guarded. But then she gave a single nod. "Mr. Blake," she said, voice even, "you may approach the bench." The tension broke, and a slow exhale moved through the gallery like a wave. I walked past the jury box. The door was cracked open, and I could hear faint footsteps behind it. They hadn't gone far. I wasn't just talking to the judge now. I was talking to the people who would decide everything. Standing at the bench, I took a deep breath, and then I let it out, all of it. I talked about what had been left out, about the safety consultant whose warnings got buried in dense jargon, about the plant manager who dodged questions and the logs that mysteriously disappeared, about the union rep who begged for better training only to be pushed aside by a story that placed all the guilt on one man. I told it like it was. A broken system had failed long before the accident, and now that system was trying to pretend it had nothing to do with the crash. And something changed. I could feel it. A shift in the room. A stillness that wasn't just silence, it was reflection. Even the prosecutor seemed to thaw, nodding slightly like he knew I wasn't wrong. The defense attorney looked at his client, eyes wide, as if this was the moment the whole trial had been waiting for. Finally, the judge lifted her gavel. Not harsh, just a gentle tap. This court finds Mr. Blake's statement relevant and necessary to the pursuit of justice, she said, her voice strong and clear. And just like that, I knew. My time in the courtroom wasn't over after all. It was just beginning. They called the jury back. Not something you see every day. The courtroom, usually governed by routine and ritual, suddenly felt like something else entirely, like a living, breathing place. Not just a chamber of procedure, but a space where the right to be heard had somehow been reclaimed. Word spread fast. Reporters called it unprecedented. Folks in the community said it was conscience finally standing up and getting a seat at the table. And the jurors? They would later say they felt something lift, like they were finally free to weigh everything, not just the parts they were handed. But in that moment, with me back in my seat and the jury filing into the box again, I realized something deeper. Justice, real justice, isn't just about verdicts or rules. It's a commitment to chase down every piece of the truth, no matter how messy, how inconvenient, or how late it comes. You could feel the change in the room. The jurors didn't look dazed or mechanical anymore. They looked alert, purposeful. No longer just enduring a process. They were engaged in it. I watched them lean in, speak softly to each other, brows furrowed, not in confusion, but in concentration. Through the door's crack, I could hear it, voices murmuring about the missing logs. Someone brought up the union rep's testimony. Another asked again about those alarms that were bypassed. They were doing the work, really doing it. And then, a stillness. The foreperson tapped the papers, and time seemed to hold its breath. Verdict forms passed hand to hand, folded, carried forward, placed in the judge's line of sight. You could feel the weight in every step she took to the bench. She opened them, read them, and spoke. Not guilty of manslaughter. Guilty of reckless endangerment. It wasn't a full acquittal. It wasn't blind punishment. It was something balanced, something considered, something human. She went on, speaking directly to the factory's management, ordering a full safety audit, bringing in oversight, making sure the pattern wouldn't repeat. Her words didn't just close the trial, they cracked open accountability. Behind me, I heard a long exhale, not just from one person, from many. The man on trial, he bent forward, face buried in his hands. The manager, seated stiffly nearby, paled. And I just sat there, soaking it in. The gavel came down one final time. And justice, the real kind, not perfect, not polished, but honest, settled over the room like a quiet storm finally spent. Later in the hallway, people came up to me. Some I knew, some I didn't. They offered handshakes, quiet thanks, even a few tears. A young reporter asked me what it felt like, what it meant. I told her the truth. It's not about being right. It's about being awake, about speaking up when you know something's been missed. It's about remembering that in the machinery of justice, we're not just cogs, we're caretakers. That night, I stepped out into the evening, the courthouse behind me, the town ahead, streetlights glowing soft over brick. And I stood there for a moment, just breathing, letting the weight of the day sink in. A high school teacher, a reluctant juror, a man who almost stayed quiet. I thought I didn't belong in that box. Turns out, I was supposed to be in that gallery, to witness, to speak, to shift something. And in doing so, I remembered why I teach history in the first place. Because every voice matters, especially when justice is on the line.